Andrew, at this stage, there's no report that there is swine fever in Indonesia, but in Bali, for example, which is a largely Hindu island with a large pork or pig industry, if you like, there is 800,000 pigs there, and there are steps now. There is a meeting planned next week of quarantine airline officials because of the danger that if swine flu does get into Bali, that it could then in turn get into Australia. Now, the big fear is that some scraps of food, from airline food, for example, coming from the Philippines, from China, from South Korea, these are the countries that are worst affected at the moment. It only takes the tiniest particle to get into the food chain for pigs in Bali for it then to spread very rapidly. We've already seen it in East Timor this week, and because of the flights between Bali and Australia and other countries, there is huge potential for any threat of any spread in Bali to reach its way to Australia. As I say, there is no indication at this stage that swine fever has reached Bali, but there will be a meeting next week of key officials to ensure that it doesn't spread any further.
But obviously with Bali being a tourism hub there, it does attract a lot of tourists from...
I've lost you, Andrew.
Unfortunately, I think we've lost Anne there, as she's saying. So, look, maybe we ought to come back to her. All right, Donald Trump has hit out at the Democrat leading the impeachment inquiry against him, saying Adam Schiff should be charged with treason. The congressman has warned the US president against interfering in the investigation and accused him of inciting violence against the whistleblower at the centre of the inquiry. North America correspondent Connor Duffy reports.
Finland is a happy country. He's a happy leader, too.
That may be so, but it isn't rubbing off on Donald Trump. He's lashed out at the Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff, who is leading the impeachment inquiry.
We don't call him Shifty Schiff for nothing. He's a shifty, dishonest guy.
US-Scandinavian relations took a back seat as President Trump made it clear he wants the congressman out.
He should resign from office in disgrace, and frankly, they should look at him for treason because he is making up the words of the President of the United States.
Visiting the Vatican, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo confessed he heard the exchange between the President and Ukraine's leader, which sparked the inquiry.
As for was I on the phone call, I was on the phone call.
Despite the verbal volley from the President, Democrats say they only intend to speed up the impeachment inquiry. And if the White House doesn't produce the documents thereafter by the end of the week, they'll issue a subpoena here too. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and Congressman Schiff say they're not fooling around.
We are proceeding deliberately, but at the same time, we feel a real sense of urgency.
If the White House continues to block subpoenas, they're threatening extra charges. The President's request to meet the whistleblower, who revealed the details of the phone call, was declined.
This is a blatant effort to intimidate witnesses. It's an incitement to violence.
The State of the Union, deeply divided. Connor Duffy, ABC News, Washington.
Let's stay in the United States. Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders has cancelled campaign events until further notice after undergoing a heart procedure. The 78-year-old experienced chest pains while speaking to supporters in Las Vegas. He was taken to hospital where he was treated for a blocked artery. The Vermont senator will rest for the next few days and says he's feeling good after the surgery. Let's return to Indonesia and our correspondent Anne Barker in Jakarta. Anne, hopefully you can hear me. So we're just talking about the threats, possible threats, certainly in Bali, which is a tourist hub. So is the concern that the disease could be brought in from other Asian nations, given there are so many tourists from China, South Korea and Philippines where African swine fever has taken hold?
That's exactly right, Andrew. There are several ways this disease can spread. It's highly contagious, and once a pig has it, there's virtually a 100% fatality rate. So you only need the tiniest scrap of food or somebody on a plane that has even the most minute particle of the disease on their clothing and their boots, whatever. And this is how the disease has spread already now to Southeast Asia. Because of the number of flights that are coming into Bali, there is concern that this disease will find its way to Bali soon. As I said, there's about 800,000 pigs at the production stage that are ready to be slaughtered at any given time in Bali. So it is a sizable industry that's getting towards 1 million pigs, an area of Bali or an area of Indonesia where pork is quite popular. Now, obviously, there are many flights to Australia, to East Timor as well, I should add. The flights into Indonesia go via Bali. So now that we have an outbreak of the disease in East Timor, there's a chance too that that could spread via a plane to Bali and then on to Australia. So it's taken about a year for the outbreak in China to make its way to the Philippines, for example. Only in the last month they've detected swine fever in the Philippines. There's now a massive threat there. It's the staple food. The meat that is most popular is pork. So, of course, it could just be a matter of time now before we do see it in Indonesia.
And obviously authorities there are being vigilant, but are there any specific measures they're putting in place to prevent this from occurring?
Yeah, I think they're meeting next Thursday in Bali. There are about 80 officials, as I said earlier. The main recommendation, I think, is that restaurants and hotels don't throw food scraps, for example, into garbage in a way that they might end up in the pig food chain. Pigs, as you know, eat absolutely everything in terms of food waste. It's very common, apparently, for hotel and restaurant scraps to be sold to pig producers as feed. It's very cheap. It's a way of recycling that food. But again, as I say, you only need one tiny piece of contaminated meat or food scrap to make its way into that feed chain, and then you have one pig that's contaminated, and it's so contagious that you would expect the rest of the herd would either become contaminated very quickly or have to be culled to prevent that contamination. So I think this time next week, we will probably hear of measures that are being taken in Bali. It's quite possible other areas of Indonesia where it's Christian, where pork meat is very popular, may end up having to take similar measures as well.
And thanks very much. That's our Indonesia correspondent, Anne Barker, in Jakarta.
Thank you, Andrew.
Now, to give us an insight into what swine fever could do to Australia's agricultural sector, meat and livestock analyst Simon Coulty joins us from Wangaratta. Simon, thanks very much for talking to us. This is obviously a huge concern for people such as yourself. What sort of threat does African swine fever pose to Australia?
Well, Andrew, it provides both opportunities and threats. So as your previous reporter just alluded to, we have the disease now in East Timor, which is only 650 kilometres from Darwin. There's been 108 outbreaks so far since the September the 9th, when it was first discovered. And I guess the real concern is when it gets to Australia, Andrew, what would it do here? And I think there's lessons to be learnt from both Europe and from Asia. So in Asia, we've seen it spread at an extraordinary rate. And as just said by the previous reporter, it's those food scraps. Well, they're known as swill, and they're fed to pigs in backyards. So in China, 30% of pigs reside in backyards, and that's the cause, or one of the main causes of contamination, is that it's in the food chain as we speak. And the disease does not affect people, humans. So it can exist in the food chain for a long, long time and not affect anything. So what we're finding, Andrew, is that it's being spread from the backyards to the working place, and it gets contaminated throughout the entire system in China. In Europe, it's spread through wild boars, no different to our own feral pig population. And that's what should, God forbid it ever enter here, it's our feral pig population that is the main concern for us.
OK, so, and obviously the Australian government is now taking steps to ensure it does not pass to feral pigs here, in that they've sent dogs to Darwin. Is this a positive step, at least in your book?
Well, it is very positive, and I was at the meeting that the Minister, Bridget McKenzie, held on September the 6th. So at short notice, she collected pretty well all the major representatives of the livestock industry, as well as the chief vets from every state and federally. And a whole day was spent at the round table discussing our concerns on African swine fever. The real issue is that it won't magically go over the water from East Timor to Darwin. It's really human traffic that is spreading this disease so far and wide. I mean, up until last Friday, when we had the announcement on East Timor, the closest neighbours that had it was Vietnam and the Philippines, 1,500 kilometres and 2,000 kilometres away. So the real fear here, and what's been brought to the attention is it's humans, and whether they come through Darwin, Sydney, Melbourne, are going to be the main cause of bringing African swine fever into Australia.
Simon, by some estimates, as many as half of the world's pigs could be infected by the middle of next year. In other words, loss of half the population of the world's pigs, which equates to a very large proportion of the world's protein supply. What effect will that have? And I guess this is where you talk about not only threats to Australia, but also opportunities.
That's correct, Andrew. So that's an extraordinary number, and never in my lifetime, nor probably the history of meat exports globally, have there been such a loss in protein in such a short space of time, 20%. So what does that mean? That means there's going to be rising meat prices globally, whether it's chicken, pork, beef or sheep meat, for the next 5 to 10 years. And China has already responded to that as this crisis has worsened. So it was only August the 4th, 12 months ago last year, that the first disease was made known. And in that time, I mean, up until about 2 weeks ago, they announced 39% loss. And I'm equating, or if the same accelerated loss continues in China, we could be close to 70% before this year is out. So Vice President Xu has just recently said that there will be a deficit of 10 million tonnes of protein in China as a result of the disease, and that prices will spike in the last quarter of this year and in the first half of next year to very high levels. So there will be scarcity within China, and they are responding already. We've got imports of beef into China up 58% for the year. Pork is up 66%, and the list goes on and on in terms of how they're desperately trying to bring in other proteins to fill the void, Andrew.
Well, and that leads to the question of, can Australia's food security be guaranteed, particularly in terms of producing protein? And will that also mean the local meat prices will rise?
I think it's inevitable, Andrew, the local meat prices will rise. And that's not just in Australia, but that will be globally, whether you live in America, New Zealand, England, it doesn't matter. This is a problem that won't go away and will be around for the next 5 to 10 years. So I guess food security in Australia, I don't think will ever be a question, because we are a net exporter of food with a population of only 25 million. When you've got a population of 1.3 billion people and you've got a loss of 50% of your entire hog population, and that is the number one protein in China is pork. It's 30 kilos per person per year, compared to chicken at 12 kilos per person and beef at 7. So the real concern is not so much food scarcity here, but throughout Asia and in particular China.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite concerning, isn't it? Because not only are there health implications, but severe economic implications too.
Without doubt, and I guess the trade war has added a layer of complexity to this problem that I guess has really, made it very unpredictable on what is going to happen next. 2 weeks ago, the Chinese government lifted the tariffs, the impunitive tariffs that it put in place against the US. And they lifted it on soybeans and on pork, purely because of the tightness in supply that's going on. So it's a complex problem that's been made even more complex by the trade wars that's been going on between United States and China.
Simon Quilty, really appreciate your time tonight. Thanks very much for talking to us.
Thanks, Andrew.
Authorities are investigating Australia's biggest after-hours doctor's service over